15 years ago, Kimber Simpkins gave up being a lawyer and dove into the intensive study of yoga, with barely a glance back. Since then, yoga has brought more joy and delight to her life every day. Kimber is a yoga teacher, an author, and a social justice frontier maker. Her book, Full, How I Learned to Satisfy My Insatiable Hunger and Feed My Soul, offers women a guide in the direction of loving themselves just the way they are. Her second book, 52 Ways to Love Your Body, is based on the yoga workshop in which she shares with women the tools that led her from loathing her body to loving it. In addition to her work around body image and eating, Kimber finds herself drawn to the question of how yoga can help our innate connection to nature stay vibrantly alive while living in urban environments. When not on her yoga mat, you may find her playing, meditating, dancing, writing, or hula hooping in her backyard. Please join me in welcoming Kimber Simpkins.
Yeah, we met just a couple months ago at a gathering that we were co-participants in and also co-presenters for, and I think you were speaking back then in your topic about educating yoga teachers about the language choices that get made in yoga classes, which is a really passionate focus for me as well. And I wonder if you could talk more about the direct importance of language when it comes to being a yoga teacher in a classroom environment in which students might be struggling with body-centered self-acceptance.
Yeah, there's a couple of things around that. One is to be really careful about what you say about your own body as a yoga teacher. That if you shame or put down or make negative comments or comparisons about your own body, your students take that in. Mm-hmm. And I know for myself, I had an experience about that, of my yoga teacher saying something really negative about her thighs in class, and it really triggered me. And this was like really early on, but I was like, if she doesn't like her thighs, what does she think about mine? Mm-hmm. And so it's very distracting. It's very triggering for someone who's had body image issues or an eating disorder. It can actually put a little tear in the relationship between teacher and student. So to be aware of that a lot of people are in yoga class for more of a safe space where they don't have to deal with the judgments in their own head. And so it's really important for teachers not to express their own judgments about their own bodies in class, unless it's contextualized in some way where you're transforming that judgment into something positive. Mm-hmm. Then the other thing is about comparing other people's bodies, or talking about like a certain pose only being available to a certain body type or to a certain weight, or limiting somehow the availability of yoga to people who are, who have a certain body type. Mm-hmm. Or talking about like food or what people have eaten, or using dieting language, or assuming that people want to lose weight. So those things more about like third parties and in general can also be very triggering as well.
Yeah.
And so it's good to sort of use the self-study aspect of yoga mm-hmm. to really look within ourselves as teachers to see how our language might be unskillful and how we're approaching our students and might increase suffering instead of lessen it.
Yeah, and what would you make as a recommendation if a student is verbalizing in class about their body? How could a teacher skillfully respond? It's hard, like in the moment often, like when a yoga class is happening. I do have students say interesting things like, "This is my bad shoulder," mm-hmm. which is always an interesting comment. And I often will just very lightly touch their shoulder and say, like, "Your shoulder looks good to me. Mm-hmm. It looks like a good shoulder that's having a hard time." Mm-hmm. And that shifts it, very slightly in some ways, which can be really, and that always that kind of jolts people out of that thing of mm-hmm. right, I just called my shoulder a bad shoulder. It's like, it's a good shoulder that's struggling. Yeah.
And also, it can be great, if a student can say can actually come out with a negative body mm-hmm. Comment about themselves in class. And it really depends on kind of what the comment is, mm-hmm. but it can be really good for the teacher to just reflect back to them you have a beautiful body. Mm-hmm. Thank you for bringing it to yoga.
I'm really glad you're here, like you and your whole body just the way you are.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that can help to shift it too. And just to like keep reflecting back to the students, seeing their beauty and seeing their wholeness, and seeing their bodies as good and whole, like no matter what they can and can't do.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Years ago, I don't know if I shared this with you when we were meeting together in Austin, but years ago I was in a car accident. I was in the passenger seat. I had my feet on the dashboard. I don't know if people do that, but the way the accident happened, I damaged my right hip joint significantly. And that required me to have about a year of dysfunction in my hip until the motor vehicle accident insurance company and the lawyers involved were willing to have me see a specialist. And I had a major hip surgery that actually failed, and then I had my hip replaced a year after that. So I have one, what I call bionic hip, and one biological hip. But when I was going through that whole process, based on my own recovery from my body image issues and my eating disorder, I don't really have a language culture with myself that says, this is my bad hip or this is my good hip. But I do remember referring to, and I still do this with my students, that was my opportunity hip. And the opportunity for me was to learn about my body intelligence, making messages when needed for me to slow down or redirect or become more kind or more curious or more accepting. And it was a life event that lasted several years, from the car accident to sort of the resolution of that. And of course I go on now having a bionic hip. But I wouldn't trade it in for the lessons I learned from the opportunity of my right hip and my body. And I spoke about it publicly with a lot of my students, and I was on crutches sometimes, and I had a walker for a short time, so it was obvious to them. Speaking about it was congruent with the actual experience. And they've changed their language culture too, that they talk about their opportunity shoulder or the season of challenge that their lower back is facing. And when we are teachers, we get to help make a language culture like that. And I wonder if there's other parts of your language culture that you now see your students really internalizing and then sharing with each other. And if you could speak about that.
Yeah, I definitely, one of the things that I definitely notice is that students don't engage in body bashing around me at all. That they're really really good about that. And that's huge, because I can definitely tell often, like a new student, like how new someone is to me if they're talking about their body in a way that's unkind or unempathetic or ununderstanding. And that's a really big difference. And so I notice the way that people talk about their bodies as just being genuinely more kind. Of like, oh, like my body's having a hard time right now.
Yeah.
Or like, or yeah, I'm struggling with this. Or yeah, I'm feeling challenged about this. And that's really different than saying like, oh, like, you know, this part of my body is a dud, it's bad, like, oh, it's impeding me, it's an obstacle. And so it's really sweet to hear people talk in a way, like owning parts of their body, thinking about their body even as like, you know, having like all the parts of their body are like teammates, and one of their teammates is having a hard time, you know, and isn't able to like, you know, play up to like what it normally plays up to, and to be more understanding about that and supportive around it instead of harsh.
Yeah, very much so. I celebrate that with you, that your students are getting that conversation as a part of them, embedded, internalized, that they can share it now, and it goes out from their studentship with you to their relationships and their families and their friends and beyond that.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, because I know we're both in recovery from disordered eating patterns, maybe of similar cadences and tempos and issues, and maybe somewhat different. But what do you know about how you developed your behaviors? I often ask my students, was there something that we were trying to soothe or distract ourselves from or to numb? Was there an event, a stimulating event that you could remember where you felt like food is my go-to now? What do you know about that in your own life?
Yeah, you know, one of the things that, the thing that really triggered the first incarnation of my eating disorder, of
the being anorexic was dieting culture and dieting with my mom, and feeling actually really strongly like I wasn't very good at dieting, and that I wanted to be good at it. Because there was a lot of positive reinforcement around it, right? Of like being thin, and I wanted to be really good at dieting. And so what I figured out is the only way that I could be good at dieting was just to not eat, or to eat as little as possible, to eat way under what the calorie allotments were, and that was the only way I figured out how to be good at it. So for me, it was kind of this thing of like, I want to be good at this. I was like a pleaser, I want to feel like I'm good at this thing. And also the desire for like to have like a perfect body and to be on like a perfect diet and all those things. And then later, I actually came out of being anorexic from the experience. It's hard. I talk about it in full. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what it was that brought me out of being anorexic. But one of the things that happened was that I had a really terrible experience in a hotel of the concierge coming into my room, and I mean, you could call it making a very strong pass at me, but to me it felt like attempted rape. And after that, I could no longer starve myself, and I kind of had this impression later on that what I was doing was using food to numb, and also trying to use food and body fat as a way to protect myself. And so then I developed more of like a binge eating disorder, which had kind of been repressed a little bit while I was anorexic, and then kind of came out more full-fledged after that.
I'm sorry that happened, the experience in the hotel.
Yeah, a lot of it I think has been around like having control over my body.
Yeah, that's understandable, isn't it? In such a like large and vast universe, and the multiple complexities of human dynamics, and our bodies go through changes with biological development and hormones and aging and motherhood, and in so many ways. Of course, we want some feeling where we have control over something. And it sounds like you were good enough at restricting that you went not just from dieting with your mom, but restricting into the point of being anorexic. And then when you started eating in the binge eating part, did you find that any part of your body at first felt relieved to have food again? I mean, to come back to...
I think there definitely was a sense of being relieved in my physical body, but I was so detached from my physical body that I wasn't aware of that at all. But my body was really happy, I think, to like start eating again, but my mind was completely still just vicious about it. And so one of the things that was super painful about that period, which lasted a very long time, was that even though I wasn't physically anorexic any longer, I was still mentally anorexic. So I still had this mental anorexic, this anorexic in my head, who was then torturing me over the fact that I had started to eat again. Before, she was, proud of the fact that I wasn't eating and that I was really skinny and all of that. She didn't have that anymore, so she was extra vicious and extra harsh, and I completely identified with that voice as if it were my voice.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I had a similar conversation in my head at different seasons in my eating disorder. She was never very kind.
No, that was not her forte.
No. It sounds like we also shared a bit of a history about perfectionism. And perfectionism kind of requires rigid thinking, or what I sometimes call black and white thinking, all or nothing thinking. How did you go from perfectionistic thinking to more flexible thinking? Do you have any sense of that?
I think that the yoga practice helped a lot, and especially yoga practice and meditation. I think metta practice was really huge with that, and realizing that I was a lot more flexible with other people than I was with myself, and that real sense that Pema Chodron expressed metta, loving kindness practice. She describes it as cultivating an unconditional friendship with yourself. And that description of it, of like, a friendship with myself, and that realization that I needed to really apply that to my mind and my body, and this recognition that I would never give my friends a hard time the way I'm giving myself a hard time. And that one of the ways to soften around my black and white thinking was to treat myself like I was entitled to the grays.
Yeah.
Like it was okay to have gray places, and that it's okay to not do it all right.
Yeah.
And to not have it perfect.
Yeah. Your Skype got a little bit frozen there, so I'll wait for you to come back. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, now you're a little fuzzy, but you're back. You know, one of the things that I talk about in my book, I have a couple illustrations in there. One is the cycle of addiction, one is the cycle of recovery, and then there's one called the cycle of freedom. And traditionally, in an addiction model, they'll have a cycle, like a little circle like this, and there'll be one way to get out. And that is not using the substance or not doing the behavior.
Right.
And having just that one exit ramp, as I call it, is not enough when it comes to an eating disorder or really any other addiction, because the cycle has triggers all around the cycle. And with food, you can't just no longer ingest it. That's called anorexia.
Problem, right?
Yeah. And with perfectionism, we also need to know where the exit ramps are out of our perfectionistic thinking. And so I put these little arrows on my illustration, like here's your exit ramp, here's an exit ramp. If you missed that one, here's the next exit ramp. If you missed it again, here's another exit ramp. And as I look back on my perfectionistic thinking, this concept would have been alien to me 25 years ago. When I was getting into my recovery, I had to start thinking more flexibly, more strategically, more kindly, and to consider anywhere in my cycle I could interrupt it. I could pause it and reconsider at this fork in the road. Do I want to go around that cycle again, or do I want to try something different right here? And a big factor in being able to do that was my discovery of yoga. And I don't know how you discovered yoga or Pema Chodron, or if you can reflect back on that and tell us, when you discovered yoga, was it like immediately and overwhelmingly helpful? Was it kind of a little bit weird culture? Was your body saying yes right away? And what did your mind think about yoga?
Yeah, so what's interesting about my first experience with yoga was I was 18 years old. I had moved from the Midwest out to the West Coast for my first year of college. And the yoga class that my dorm mates took me to on campus was all like chakras and scarves and incense. And I felt completely alienated by it. And I also felt like, wow, you know, this like hour-long class I could have spent on the treadmill or the Stairmaster and gotten so much more done. And I also spent the entire time like comparing myself to my dorm mates, and it was painful. It was like really, it was my anorexic mindset in full overload. And so I didn't like it at all. I wanted to have nothing to do with it. And then over the next 10 years, I kind of did a few things that were related to yoga. Like I took martial arts and we did yoga class. And then it was when I was actually pregnant with my son, that one of the things that I remembered was that the only time that I remember not judging myself was in Shavasana at the end of that yoga class. That my mind could like be somewhere else, not criticizing myself. And that was wonderful.
What a relief. What a tremendous relief.
Yeah, and so that was what really brought me back to it, because I knew that I didn't want to go through pregnancy judging myself and criticizing myself. I didn't want to be a parent who was caught up in judging myself and criticizing myself. That I wanted to do better than that. I wanted to kind of heal my relationship with my body and with my mind. And I didn't have a very clear idea about that yet, but that's what really pointed me in the direction of yoga, was that memory of not judging during Shavasana.
I think that's phenomenal. What a great sense of relief you must have had. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
And so let me just come back around to your first book is called Full. And I wonder if you could talk about the role of hunger in our lives as human beings.
One of the things that's really interesting about hunger is, like body image, it takes place in this black box in our minds. just like we don't talk very often about how we feel about our bodies or how we look at our bodies or think about our bodies, we also don't talk very much about hunger. It's a very private thing. We don't talk about how hungry we are. We often don't talk about what we're hungry for. We experience those sensations internally, and there's not kind of like a big cultural conversation about like hunger and how much is good and how much is bad, and like we really conceal our hunger in a lot of ways, and especially as women, I think there's a lot of pressure to not be hungry or to suppress our hunger. I mean, there's hunger suppressants, appetite suppressants, right? It's kind of unladylike to have an appetite, and so that's one of the parallels that I found definitely within my own life around hunger and body image was how much I needed to really shine the light on that and start giving my hunger attention, just like I needed to give attention to the fact that that I was ashamed of my body, and I was also ashamed of the fact that I was ashamed of my body. So there were like multiple levels of shame involved there. And I was also ashamed of my hunger. I had a lot of shame around how hungry I was, that I felt hungry all the time. I was hungry between meals, before meals, after meals. It was as if, having been anorexic, it kind of unleashed this hunger. It was just constant for me. I never ever felt full. And so I didn't kind of know what it felt like to be full. And so that was actually one of the things opened the door for me around writing the book Full, is that I started asking my friends, is like, do you ever feel full? What does it feel like? What do what makes you feel full? Is there something different about how you're eating? Because I had just assumed that everybody felt the same way I did. And I was very slow to realize, like, no, some people actually feel full. And they don't even feel like thinking about food or talking about food after they're full, which I was like, really? Wow, what is that like? And so I wanted to explore that question of like, so what does it really mean to be full? Have I ever felt full? And then I started to look in detail at the different kinds of hunger that I felt, that not all hunger was the same, and starting to notice, like, when do I genuinely feel full? And starting to slow down the process of eating, noticing, getting curious about all of it, not criticizing myself for it, but just being really open to like, okay, what is this feeling that I'm having right now? Is it really hunger? What kind of hunger is it? How can I meet it? And finding out that, there's lots of different kinds of physical hunger, but there's also lots of different kinds of like emotional and even spiritual hunger that I needed to learn how to address as well. And one of those things that I was really hungry for was for kindness. I was hungry for my own kindness. I was hungry for the sense of feeling loved by me.
I think that's one of the base hungers for human beings, actually, is to have a sense that we can warmly regard ourselves, and that we won't, I call it self-abandoning in my book. It's the practice of not self-abandoning into non-kindness for self, or into condescension, or not self-abandoning into other people's needs always come first, or not self-abandoning into being punitive with the body rather than respectful or kind.
Exactly.
I hear in what you're saying there about both hunger and fullness, like a high level of and a good personal capacity for curiosity. Do you have any sense, how did you go from perfectionistic thinking to being willing to have curiosity?
Well, that's again one of the things that so the first yoga teacher I really connected to in public classes was studying a lot of Pema Chodron, and so that's how I got into learning more about Pema Chodron and going deep with her teachings. And Pema talks a lot about curiosity as like this it can kind of be used almost as a synonym for mindfulness. That curiosity has this openness and this friendliness and this freshness to it. That's non-judgmental, that's very present moment. And so in a lot of ways, like, you can't think of curiosity as being kind of a secular way to understand mindfulness, but there's also a sweetness to it, almost like a childlikeness to it, that you can be open in how you're looking at yourself and the world. And there is something that's very open-hearted about it and wholehearted about curiosity.
Yeah, lovely. So something that comes to mind for my students when I share a lot of my personal life with my students, and I imagine that you do as well, including the transition from perfectionism to curiosity, and from being shocked what yoga is to really incorporating yoga into your life. And frequently I'm talking with students about yoga isn't just a practice that's on your yoga mat, and it's not just an intervention that we use to bring on relief or to feel a little bit better from time to time. It's really a way of life. And one of the ways that they start asking questions about that is, well, how will I do my job in a yogic way? Or how do I parent in a yogic way? And I know that in this telesummit, 6 out of 7 of us are published authors. And I wonder if you could talk about how you wrote your book and how yoga was a part of that. And how did you make the rhythm for writing? How did you not censor yourself too much? How did you stay curious about what was coming out on the page as you were writing? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, I really had to treat the whole writing of both books as this process. So it's very much like starting out as a new yoga student to going deeper and deeper into my practice. I had never written a book before, and so I really had to kind of have that same open, like, I don't really know what I'm doing, and that's okay, and I'm going to slowly figure it out. And so even like how I approached my yoga practice was how I had to approach the book. And also one of the things that was really helpful was just how important with yoga like regular consistent practices. And so I made, just like I had begun to make when I became a teacher, which is when I started my writing the book. I had made yoga into a daily practice for myself that I was doing every day, and so I started making writing into a daily practice as well.
Yeah.
And that treating the writing with a lot of just patience and a lot of like letting myself make mistakes, letting myself figure things out, and just a daily practice of like showing up to do a little bit of writing made a huge difference. And it really came to a culmination in writing the second book, because I had a 100-day deadline for the second book. It was shorter, it was about half the size of full, but they wanted me to write it in 100 days. And so I've written full over the course of 10 years. So that was a big deal to be asked to write it in 100 days. But I really treated it as this practice, in addition to the fact the book is called 52 Ways to Love Your Body. So I knew I couldn't abuse my body while writing the book. I needed to really take seriously the idea of loving my body while writing the book. And so I had to be consistent with my yoga practice, consistent with my eating, consistent with like all the other like physical and mental practices that support me, including meditation. And that allowed me to show up for writing the book day after day, basically like a full-time job for 100 days.
Yeah. Well, that's quite a short deadline. I'm impressed.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I talk about in my book, I hear you referencing this, though you probably have your own language culture for it. There's 4 essential life skills in my book. They start with getting in the gap, which means getting grounded, paying attention, becoming present. It's kind of the equivalent of mindfulness done repeatedly, consistently, until a person comes into their presence, their inner presence, rather than their mental chatter. And then we go through getting comfortable, feeling uncomfortable. I know I spoke about that when I was talking in Austin with the yoga community. And then moving from love, not shame. And the 4th life skill is called personal buoyancy. And it's really this compilation of the 7 daily essentials that we need on our body dashboard, which you just referred to a couple of them. In order to write your book, you had to have like proper nutrition, and you should be hydrated and have good periods of rest and some periods of activity. Don't drop your yoga practice, and don't like do all-nighters. So how did you get a sense of what your body would most need to make writing a joyful process and a sustainable process? What kind of signals did you get from your body?
One of the big things one of the big things is my body really likes knowing that it's going to get some yoga in every day. Like, it's a sort of trust thing between me and my body. My body's like, okay, we're going to get some yoga in. That, like, just looking forward to it, knowing that it's going to come. There's this kind of like
my body appreciates the routine of it so much.
Mm-hmm.
And then also there's the thing of like listening to my butt, which is like my butt says, like, I'm tired of sitting. We have to get up now. And so much of my life, especially, you know, going through law school and everything, and just being, you know, a college student and all of that was about overriding that feeling and ignoring it.
Yeah.
And now I find that it's just really important for me to pay attention to that. It's like, if my butt says it's time to get up and move, it's time to get up and move, and to just listen to that, and to find, you know, either to go for a walk or to do a little bit of yoga practice. I have a Bosu ball that I balance on and play with, and that's fun. But to really pay attention to that very clear signal that I spent years ignoring, that my body's saying it's time to move.
Yeah. Yeah, so you really transitioned from like I'm going to diet, I'm going to restrict food, I have a perfectionistic thinking strategy, I have my inner anorexic, now you're binging and so on, and that's changing your body composition, but you still have the anorexic mind, into a great deal of respect for your body and its signals and its needs and wants. And I just want to celebrate that for a moment with you. It's a big triumph to come to that.
It really is, and actually it's something that I never imagined that I would be able to do. Like, I was really hoping at the beginning of the journey that I would come to like a level of acceptance towards my body, and maybe like a sense of like tolerating it. And I was really surprised that yoga could take me way past acceptance and tolerance to a place of like celebration and love, and really connecting to the wisdom of my body.
Yeah.
And just feeling an enormous sense of gratitude and friendliness towards my body that I honestly did not think was possible in general, but I certainly didn't believe was possible for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in my deepest like downward spiral in my disordered eating, I was just hoping for the kind of relief that might be like a little bit of acceptance. I didn't imagine that I could feel tremendous. In fact, I have a very strong memory of this, where I was feeling this thing I would call unconditional joy, which I couldn't have had a name for at the time. And when I say unconditional joy, I mean I had no etiology for why I would be feeling joyful. I hadn't done a good workout, I hadn't like accomplished a particular academic or athletic undertaking. It just sort of popped out of nowhere that I was feeling joyful. And my next thought was, I'm going to die. And the actual image of that in my mind was that I was crossing the street in Boston, and I would get run over by a car. Like, the only conceivable reason to feel that joyful at that moment is that in a few moments I was going to be dead. So this was looking back on a belief system that I had about whether or not you get to feel joyful, or have permission to be on the planet, or have permission to grow and evolve into something more than shame. And I encountered that fear of joy a number of times in my recovery process. Did you ever face something like that?
Yes. I love, do you know what Brene Brown calls that? She calls it foreboding joy, where like in the moment where you're super happy and you're excited to be like with your family on vacation, and then the first thought you have is like, oh my God, it's all going to be taken away from us. A plane is going to crash on us right now, or something, right?
Yeah.
And it is a way of kind of holding joy at arm's length. For me, I had a really interesting experience that kind of moved me through that block a lot. When I was a lawyer, I got my wisdom teeth taken out, and whatever drugs they used on me for the wisdom teeth, when I was in recovery, I was in this complete bliss and just like so happy. And my partner came to pick me up, and I was like, "You're so beautiful. I love you so much. Our lives are so wonderful. Oh, this is all so great." And then that state kind of lasted. That state of bliss just kind of lasted for like 2 or 3 days, and I reevaluated my entire life. Like, oh, like my partner really wants to have kids. Why are we waiting to have kids? Family's important. And also the thing of like, wow, I'm trying to be the best lawyer in the world, but I don't care about being a lawyer at all. And so all of these things that I've been really caught up about just kind of fell away in the state of bliss. That was drug induced. At the same time, I had this real sense of like, oh wow, I actually don't have to have this drug to feel this way. Like I very much got the sense of like, this is actually, the drug like opened something up for me around this, but this is me. I'm having this experience.
experience. This experience is accessible to me no matter what. And I have had that experience since through yoga without drugs. And that actually, what was beautiful about that is it gave me a real sense of trusting bliss. I like trusting the wisdom of bliss, letting myself really settle into it, letting myself really enjoy it. And so since then, I've actually not had that so much, which I've really enjoyed. And it's interesting because that was one of the things, that experience of having that tremendous bliss. I did have this longing to feel that again, and I wasn't sure how, but that was another thing that yoga, that kind of like brought me back in the direction of yoga. Because I was like, I think yoga might help me feel this. I don't know why I feel that way, but I think that I need to check it out.
Yeah, very good.
And I was correct about that.
And in yoga, we call that experience of bliss, that most indwelling sense of bliss. I call it unconditional belonging or radical contentment. It's the Anandamaya kosha at the center of the kosha model. And what I now know, and couldn't know in the early days of recovery, but sort of looking back on and then helping students with, I know that what gets in the way the most often is the mind, the Manomaya kosha. And that in fact that indwelling belonging or joy is not coming and going from us. We've been coming and going from it.
Right.
It's kind of magnetically pulling us home all the time. And to the extent that we can hear that, my experience is that we actually hear it better in the company of others who are also listening for it. Which is why I personally prefer to do my hunger, hope, and healing work where there's always a group component. Even if I have an individual client, that there's also this group opportunity to feel, to hear, to listen, and to glimpse that belonging and bliss and joy together. It normalizes that we're meant to experience this as this human ecosystem can do it and can re-experience it and then can remember that it's our most indwelling abode.
Yes. I'm teaching my yoga classes this week on the theme of belonging.
Oh, that's so lovely.
Yeah.
You know, the third life skill in my book is called Moving from Love, Not Shame. And shame kind of precludes the experience we could have of belonging because as a process, shame is profoundly isolating. It's the story that I alone am flawed or broken or will never be good enough and that I'm experiencing this uniquely painful thing. That isolation, I think, is very pervasive in our culture when shame shows up. I like to call shame the shame monster. So sometimes it's coming up as a monster, an intruder. It's blocking what we could otherwise experience as love or community or connection. And when I talk to my students about it, I want to make clear that we internalize shame initially as a protective mechanism. We weren't just dumb. We weren't just not seeing it clearly. We weren't just, as shame would tell us, flawed enough that this story is believable. But once we internalized it, it became something that echoed so often that it felt real. And I hear you talking about outgrowing shame as you're talking about kindness with your body and curiosity and so on. I wonder if you could speak just a little bit more explicitly about how you overcame the voice of shame and what kinds of things you had to say to it.
Yeah. So one of the things that I did through my yoga practice and meditation practice was I started to name those shaming voices in my head. One was the inner anorexic. I also had one that was like my inner prison guard. There was an inner prison guard and the inner prison system. Yeah, well, yeah. I used to work on behalf of state prisoners, helping them get mental health treatment. So that was my job as a lawyer. So I had that like in my head. I had the inner prison guard and the inner prisoner. And then I also had this really interesting character who kind of came up around my yoga practice, who I started using my yoga practice early on, or kind of like, mid-range early on, when I started pushing myself too hard. I was doing a lot of Ashtanga and Vinyasa classes, and I was injuring myself a lot. I didn't have good alignment or anything, and so I was injuring myself in these really intense classes, pushing myself. And I kept thinking it was the teacher, but it was really like not every teacher could be doing this to me. And so I slowly started to realize like it was the voice in my head that was pushing me farther than I could really go, and that was really safe for me, or kind for me, or compassionate for me. And so I started talking to that voice, and I was even like, voice, who are you? And
And this, and I was inspired by the story of Buddha meeting Mara outside, like Buddha was in the cave and Mara was outside, and Mara kept like torturing him and tormenting him until Buddha finally decided, like, the next time Mara came, he was going to talk to him and say, like, Mara, is that you? Come inside, sit by the fire, have some tea with me. And so the next time the voice came up of pushiness, I was like, hey, voice, who are you? Come and have some tea with me. Let's sit and talk. And this whole image came to me of, like, this Russian gymnastics coach whose name is Svetlana. Svetlana, the Russian gymnastics coach. And she loves those little Madelines, and she loves tea, and so for her and I to like sit down and talk, and for me to realize like that this pushiness is like just her job. There's nothing personal about it whatsoever. It's like she's just my voice of like inner self-discipline, like trying to get me to move harder and faster, and like making sure that I like overcome, you know, whatever challenges or obstacles are there. And it's really like, and she actually doesn't have any personal investment in it at all. She just is, it's sort of like what she's being paid to do. And that was a really interesting thing to realize. And so I had to like, so now, and what I learned to do was that when I kind of, I think of it as like hearing her sneakers like crunch in the gravel of like during my yoga practice, right? Of like, oh, here she comes. She's about to tell me to push harder. That for me to like open the door and say, hi, Svetlana. I have some tea and cookies waiting for you already. Go ahead and enjoy them. I'm doing my yoga practice. Let's talk a little later.
Yeah. There's an exercise in my book. It's a breathing exercise. It's called saying no to say yes. And the question we can ask, a lot of people are concerned in their relationships, for example, their interpersonal relationships, about saying no. And I often have to ask them, if you say no, what are you also saying yes to? Let's put both of those things into the conversation. So even with ourselves, if I have to say no to something like saying no to shame, to what am I saying yes? If I'm saying no to self-punitive measures, to what am I saying yes? If I'm saying no to self-discipline as the Western American mindset has about discipline, what am I saying yes to? And in my language culture, I'm saying yes to self-nurturing discipline, not self-recriminating discipline, not harsh discipline, but the discipline enough to nurture my vitality and my capacity and my values to become manifest. My values were often unmanifest under the weight of my disordered eating pattern. I had life values, but I couldn't express them. And then when I couldn't express them, the shame voice got bigger. So when we're saying no to, when we get to then say yes to something else, it's more motivating to keep the no very clear. And I hear you saying no to shame and yes to your yoga practice for whatever discovery you'll have on the yoga mat on that day, that shame can't intrude or take it away from you or mar it or kind of disturb it. That's very liberating.
Yeah, definitely. Well, this is you'll like this too. This is an interesting thing. So I decided, in order to not hurt myself on my mat, I decided to start making like setting my intention every time I practice for more compassion towards myself. But what's interesting is that with that pushy voice in my head, it didn't work. I couldn't make that work. And what I ended up having to do was actually to start making a negative intention every time I got on my mat, which was just that I am not going to hurt myself today. I had to get on my mat and say no to hurting myself in order to open myself up to a practice that was more nurturing. So it's like we talk a lot about not kind of like focusing on the negative, but I needed that. Like I needed to create that boundary with myself in order to move into something more positive.
Yeah, in fact, I like that. If we look at the yamas and niyamas, when we say non-harming, non-stealing, non-grasping, even though it's a mouthful, I like to say non-self-abandoning, which is talking to the instinct for self-abandoning. If I start right up with the concept of self-soothing instead of self-abandoning, I say, oh, now I'm going to be someone who's self-soothing, but I don't know what that is. There's like a spectrum where I've been abandoning or shaming or criticizing, so now I'm going to try not self-abandoning. And down here on the spectrum is where I can become a self-soother, and I can understand what that means. But I had to take the steps pretty slowly to get from the fixation that this was to just deciding I'm not going to self-abandon. I don't know what else I'm going to do, but I know I'm not going to self-abandon right now. And acclimating there gave me the the fortitude to keep acclimating along the way and find out, where does this go if I don't self-abandon? What happens next if I don't self-harm? What is the next thing?
I think the not self-abandoning is the idea of going to like zero, because we've been driving backwards at like 60 miles an hour, and before we can start moving forwards again, we have to stop and like go to zero. So it's like just the place where you're not self-abandoning is like hitting 0 miles per hour, being in neutral for a moment, then putting it in gear and starting to move slowly in the other direction.
Yeah. And there's a phrase I use in my recovery work with women, which is, if you have 2 toe holds in a good direction, that's all you need sometimes, is to just try to hold still where you are, even while the windstorm might be coming at you. And to realize that if our 2 toe holds are steady, we aren't being pushed backwards. That's a major success. And when the windstorm lets up, we're actually going to fly a little bit, because we've been trying to hold steady with the strength and courage that it takes to hold steady.
Oh yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I like that, coming back to zero. Like, you're not going 60 miles an hour in the wrong direction right now.
Yeah.
You know, when you talked about your gymnastics coach, I was a gymnast when I was in high school. I was a top athlete in my school system. And I'm thinking about how we learn in our culture to motivate ourselves, and one of the ways people try to motivate themselves is by shame. How would you recommend students motivate themselves if it's not through shame?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because for me, I have a very mixed relationship with self-discipline, because I've found it to be a very destructive force in my life. And so the thing that I really like to, that I often tell my students about is moving from self-discipline to self-devotion. And that's like moving in that direction of self-nurturing that you're talking about, right? Is that instead of coming to whatever I'm doing from this place of like, I have to do it, I have an obligation, like it's terrible if I fail, and I don't want to fail, I don't want to feel shame, so I have to do this. Instead to come to it like, I'm doing this out of love for myself. I'm doing this because I know I'm going to feel better after I've done it. I'm doing it because I know that my body's going to love it. I'm doing it because it's going to support everything else that I want to do in my life that's important to me. And that, like, and even like, I'm doing it because it feels like pleasurable and enjoyable and nurturing to myself. And that really shifts it in this direction of coming out of love instead of coming out of the shame.
Yeah.
And so I often talk about like, think about it as self-devotion instead of self-discipline, and that can kind of shift our relationship to it.
Yeah. I have my book set up in stages, like the first stage of recovery, the second stage of recovery, and the third, and so on. And what I hear you referring to is actually the process in the second phase of recovery, where we can start reflecting on our thoughts and our attitudes and our relationship to ourselves. We ask fewer yes or no questions. We ask questions that get us to the how and not the why. Like, why am I doing this is usually a reflexive question that we're not answering when we're in our distress. Like when we're in a shame storm, why am I doing this again is actually the sentiment, I'm so messed up, I'm so incapable, I'm so unworthy. So I try to, in the second phase of recovery, it's called svadhyaya in Sanskrit, but in my book I call it self-empathy and self-study. And the how question is different than the why question. It's even different than the what question, like, what are you going to do about this? Is often too soon before we ask the question, how did I come to think like this? How is this thinking affecting my physiology? How is this mental broadcast informing me about unmet needs? How am I going to chart this next moment in my life? What do you think about the nature of asking questions of yoga students when they're in their yoga practice? What kinds of questions would you recommend we ask?
I do it all the time. I love asking questions during yoga, because I think there's something about having the body move and being like in a pose that kind of opens us up more, that kind of like lets some of our filters down, and really speaks to the heart. And I know for me, when I'm talking to my students in yoga class, I'm talking from my big S self, and I'm talking to their big S selves too.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this way in which I'm my best self is communicating with the best self of the students. I mean, not, that there's necessarily a hierarchy, but that it's like our expanded selves are communicating. And so it's a great place to ask questions like, how does this play out in your life? Where do you see this habit or pattern in your life? And, would this little shift in thinking be helpful for that? Mm-hmm. How do you see that playing out? Yeah. And just like little questions like that kind of get us to this place of both feeling and thinking at the same time, and having that more integrated.
Yeah.
And even I think it helps to reset like patterns in the brain through working in the body. It just starts to open things up in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I also make a little distinction in my book between the right brain recovery path, which would be like intuitive, creative, spontaneous. I'm an art therapist by trade before I was a yoga teacher. So that would be like a fluid process in those directions. And then the left brain, which is like, it's logical, it's linear, it's scientific, I know where I'm going. And I'm talking in the book about bringing both hemispheres of the brain into the recovery and using what I call a whole brain model. And when we're asking questions in yoga class, if we're asking questions that the left brain doesn't have to answer, we're bringing the right brain into the yoga practice itself. We live in a left brain shifted world, so we're heavy thinkers and we're logical and scientific. And I mean, the question in yoga class, can you spread your toes, is a yes or no question, and kind of directed from the left brain, which knows the language for toes and the word for spread, and then the body, which can try spreading the toes. And a question, how might it feel to your toes if you let them spread apart, is a whole different question to be asking. And in our teacher training and yoga therapy training programs, we are really encouraging teachers to learn how to ask questions, that their students can learn the process of asking questions that move them to a whole brain approach to their life. I wonder what you might say about that in that. I think you're also talking with teachers frequently about how they ask questions in yoga class.
Yeah, definitely. Questions and the asking yourself, like, how does this feel? How does it feel when I move my hip a little bit further back? How does it feel when I root my feet a little more deeply into the earth? Like, how does that feel to you? Is so important. And my understanding is that's actually, that encouraging the students to really notice how they're feeling in the moment of the pose is actually really important for healing trauma as well, and for getting people who are just connected from their bodies to feel more integrated in their bodies. And it's great for all of us because it develops our self-awareness and our proprioception, our ability to feel where our body is in space, and it also helps us develop our interoception, that ability to feel our internal cues within our bodies.
Yeah. And it reminds me that when we can feel the internal cues, we're actually practicing the art of self-kindness that you've been talking about. How can I be more kind to my body? We're learning when we feel those sorts of cues, how do we nurture, how do we tend to, how do we become more curious about where this cue comes from? And it keeps us living the questions, which is for me really the yogic journey, that we're asking questions, not condemning the outcomes or the symptoms.
Yeah.
And in the third phase of recovery in my book, I call it forgiveness and freedom. I base it on the model of Kriya Yoga. So there's tapas, svadhyaya, ishvari, pranidhana, and I decided that I could make a language culture that translated those words to be really helpful to how I see the recovery journey. So in the third stage, forgiveness and freedom, I'm recommending that people practice self-forgiveness more often, even including forgiving themselves for the pain that they've been in, and discovering the freedom for who they are becoming, not who they thought they had to be. So that recovery is really a more and more authentic journey, and not a more white-knuckled journey. How would you use a yoga practice to encourage the practice of self-forgiveness?
One of the things that would be great in yoga practice in general is to set the intention of self-forgiveness at the beginning of any class or practice. Mm-hmm. Be like, whatever happens in this practice, I'm going to forgive myself for already.
Yeah.
My theme last week was about being only human, that we're all only human. Like, this
is your beautiful, only human body. And it's not perfect in any ideal sense, and it's not going to be, and that's okay. And so there's a way of approaching our yoga practice in general that like just sets that intention for self-forgiveness. And I might even like write the word, write this phrase like I forgive myself on a little piece of paper and put it in front of my mat, so that there's this little reminder that when I do a pose and it doesn't feel right, or I fall out of it, or whatever, I have to pause for an injury or to rest or something, like I just remember, like, I forgive myself. But specific poses, like a great pose to work on self-forgiveness would be tree pose, actually. And to do tree pose with the intention of, like, I forgive myself for not having balance here. I forgive myself for not feeling strong here. I forgive myself for whatever injury or pain or whatever my experience is here. I forgive myself for it. And to really set that intention in the pose, that whatever's here, I'm just going to be, like, friendly and loving and forgiving towards.
Right, and in fact, the practice becomes the vessel through which that deeper inquiry is going on. Tree pose becomes less relevant as a pose and more relevant as the container for our exploration and for our journey. Yes,
exactly.
Yeah. I wonder if there's a practice that you'd be willing to share with the listeners, a breathing practice or a inquiry practice or a mindfulness practice.
Yeah, one of the practices that I really love and that I use a lot in my own life is it's so simple in a way, but it's just taking one hand. I usually use my right hand, and I place it over my sternum, right over my heart center, and I just feel for a moment. I feel the warmth of my hand on my skin. Maybe my body is warmer than my hand. I just notice for a moment the temperature, and I notice my breath. And I might even notice there being like a little flutteriness energetically. Sometimes I can even feel my heart beating. And I let myself feel whatever emotions are present in my body. And just breathe into them and hold space for them. And then I offer myself a little loving kindness blessing of just saying, may I be happy, may I be well, may I be safe, may I be full of peace. And then I can go ahead and open my eyes and just see how that feels. And I use that as like a self-soothing practice very, very frequently during my days. Even if I have like a thought that's upsetting, but I realize I forgot to do something or I'm running late to something, that self-soothing, I don't even necessarily have to say the words. Like for me now, the gesture itself of having my hand and placing it over my heart has that same effect of like being very self-soothing and connecting and just honoring what I'm feeling right now without having to get into like a story about why I'm feeling it or anything else, but just acknowledging that sense of softness. There is like a nurturing self-forgiveness in it as well that I find extremely soothing as a daily practice to go to in the moment when there's some sort of trigger or difficulty that I'm facing.
Yeah, and in fact in interpersonal neurobiology, which is like my secondary study after graduate school, we talk about not needing the narrative right away. The cognition about what happened or what the story is actually can preclude or obscure our ability to simply feel, and to kind of imagine that you're resting in your right brain while you're feeling, and that we don't need the language center or the verbal center or the cognition to overshadow that. And when the right brain feels like we've met, then we can incorporate the left brain's knowledge, its capacity for helping. But often the cognition is trying to go first, such as, why am I feeling this way? I shouldn't be feeling this way. Other people don't feel this way, therefore there's something wrong with me.
Right.
Yeah. You know, I want to ask you one more question before we have to transition, and it's, I think it's a place we're going to resonate. So I want to put the question out there, because even though we both wrote books that are going out and people may be reading them individually, they might be reading them with other friends as well, or in small group book support things. I find that many times a person's ability to center on her or his own recovery, it gets warmed up by offering prayers or forgiveness or kindness to others before they can kind of internalize that process. And in one of my meditations in the book, it's called Awakening Self-Tenderness. It's to combat one of the 5 causes of suffering is hatred or dvesha. So to combat that, to turn that hatred around, we're practicing self-tenderness, but I include the other in the meditation. Like, may I offer tenderness to the part of me that suffers when I hate my thighs. And may I also extend this tenderness towards the part in others that suffers when they too hate their thighs. And I keep including the other and the individual, the other and the individual, until I'm reminding the brain of the student and also my own brain that we really are social creatures, and we have always been interdependent. We are influenced by and influencing others all the time. How might you talk about the value of forgiveness for others as a warm-up for forgiveness for ourselves, and the value of community as part of how we heal?
That's one of the things that about community and how we heal is huge. That's one of the main things that I hear in my retreats and workshops is one of the first things that we do together is we share our own stories about how we have related to our bodies now, how we've related to our bodies in the past. And it's so meaningful to hear those stories from other women, because it's again that thing of like feeling like it's a black box in our own head that nothing ever comes out of. And so the ability to kind of shed light on that, daylight it, and let that out and see that other people are having a similar experience is so meaningful. Mm-hmm. And I love the practice that you've just shared, because it reminds me a lot of Tonglen practice in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, where you're breathing in your own pain and difficulty, out relief for yourself and everyone else who's feeling the same thing. Mm-hmm. And that practice, like, you can breathe it in for everyone as well, but often it can start out with like just the difficulty that you're feeling right now, like the pain of feeling self-hatred, and you breathe in the pain of that and experience that, and then breathe out a sense of spaciousness and relief for yourself and everybody else who feels that way. And it is this really beautiful way of being able to connect in our suffering and overcoming that shame. That I love Brene Brown's definition of shame is shame as the fear of disconnection. And so it's a way of reconnecting, of like, oh yeah, in this shame, in this pain, in this difficulty, I'm remembering that other people feel this too. I'm not alone in this. Mm-hmm. And that I can explore the possibility of like at least spaciousness and openness towards myself around it. Mm-hmm. As well as offering that back out to other people. And that does have this just beautiful effect of reminding us that we're not alone in our difficulty, and that that we are not separate, really. Mm-hmm. And that goes directly to that question of shame as the fear of disconnection. Not separate.
Mm-hmm. In fact, when we recognize that we're not separate...
And actually...
Go ahead.
Yeah, that actually we are connected in our suffering. Mm-hmm. That instead of suffering being a disconnecting experience, that our suffering can actually be a connecting experience.
Yes, and then I like to say, as we're healing, it becomes collective, including retroactive. Like, to have healing benefit those events in our life that are now past but have still been painful. To even have healing benefit the people upstream from us, from whom our conditioning may have been passed down. To have like the intergenerational healing, because our healing today offers that retroactively, also lets us be people for whom healing flows downstream through our lives and our thoughts and our actions, and that we really become a part of a holistic collective process of healing. And the world needs us to do that, not because we're profoundly special and unique and in an arrogant sense, but because the world needs greater numbers of people doing that.
Yeah, and self-forgiveness is a big part of it. I think it's really useful to look at that question of like, where is it hardest for me to self-forgive? And where is it hardest for me to forgive others in my life? Because what's interesting for me is so often, like one of the hardest places for me to forgive others and myself is the same place, and it's where I've hurt other people or where I've seen someone else hurt someone else. That's actually harder to forgive than someone who's hurt me directly.
Right.
And so to really see that, like, oh, right, I find it hardest to forgive there, and also I have this kind of expectation that it's possible to never ever hurt anyone.
Oh.
And that's an interesting thing. That's an interesting assumption, that it's possible for me to never hurt anyone and I should never do it, which is a perfectionistic thought,
Yeah.
right? And that it's possible for other people to never hurt anyone and they should never do it. And that's, again, like this expectation of perfection that's not realistic. And so just looking at that particular question, like, gives me a lot more clarity around what my expectations are, what my underlying beliefs still are, and how to work with that in a more self-forgiving way.
Yes, absolutely. You must know this now through parenting or some direct experience in other relationships, that we say in the attachment theory world and in looking at the interpersonal brain of the human, that it's 30% relationship, 30% rupture in the relationship, and about 30% repair. That's considered a good equation, right? It's not all relationship without any rupture. And it's not all rupture. And it's also not all repair, that those things are weaving together. And, I take that to mean intrapersonally, from me to me. There's a relationship. Was there a rupture? How did I repair it?
Exactly.
That was really important for me in my recovery process, was to see, I just had a rupture. Now how am I going to repair it? And I called that process homecoming, coming back home. And again, I sometimes had to use the mantra all day, homecoming, 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 which is like not self-abandoning, not taking the flight escape hatch out, but coming back home. And that repair process is a part of all of our relationships when they're healthy, because we have two individuals trying to have connection and they're not always going to be completely attuned. And the expectation that we could be would be too high a standard, and we'd have two tense individuals trying to constantly be attuned. So it relaxes the system where we can have relationship rupture and repair.
I love that. It goes along with this thing that I often use in my workshops that's based on John Gottman's theory. He's the relationship specialist. And he and his team say that most relationships need to have 5 to 7 positive interactions for every 1 negative interaction. Yeah. And that, so I often, ask my students, so with your relationship with your body, do you have 5 to 7 positive interactions with your body for every 1 negative interaction? And most of them are like, no way. And it's like, well, no wonder, you feel alienated, right? And so, that kind of understanding of and so one of the things that I give them is have some kind thing that you think about your body. It's just one kind thing, one thing that you like about your body, and say it 5 to 7 times. Or think of 7 different things that you like about your body and remind yourself of them, right? But that recognizing that was a negative interaction that I just had with my body, that thought about self-hatred or about self-criticism, and then to have something to consciously repair it with makes a big difference. And that definitely starts to improve that healing process a lot.
Yeah, that's a great way for our listeners to have this conversation become something they take with them. We're going to close here in a moment, but I want to underline the really important value of 5 to 1, 5 of those positive, kind, even courageous statements for any one criticism that might happen, or a judgment or a disappointment, that we can balance the seesaw, as it were.
I also want to mention that one really great way that I've found is that instead of making the positive interactions like affirmations, I love my body's beautiful, to make them more may I see my own beauty, may I begin to see my body as lovable,
Yeah.
right? And so to really soften them, to use the may I language so that they feel more authentic and not artificial or forced in any way.
That's fabulous. I'm really glad you added that, because the forced affirmation can feel like I could fail at this, rather than,
Right.
oh, I can grow towards it.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
lovely. Yeah. Well, it's been really great to talk with you, and I'll close us here with just my great appreciation for us to be on a mutual path, a similar path, and to have met at this juncture in our lives. I feel you've contributed a lot in the last 75 minutes that listeners will benefit from, and the Hunger, Hope, and Healing community will be honored to know you and your teachings. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for including me in this, Sarahjoy. I enormously appreciate it. Happy to be here.
You're very welcome. Namaste.
Namaste.